Still a few people coming in, but I think we'll get going here. So, welcome to today's Tech Talk, sponsored by OpenJanela. I'm Terry Adamson, Fenestration Canada's Technical Director. In case you haven't heard, there's some tariff activities going on right now. Our resident tariff guru, Adrian Edge, has immersed himself in it. As much as he would prefer to be working on other member important topics, he's jumped into the tariff world in a big way. Over the past 6 weeks, he's been making contacts, gleaning information from a variety of sources, probably gathered more tariff knowledge than everyone on this call. So today, Adrian's going to give us an update on what's happening, as well as share some of the activities that Fenestration Canada is taking on to support our members. So, Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. I'll be honest. Being considered the resident tariff expert is not really what I signed up for, but this as far as I can tell is the best way for me to serve you all. It is a complicated subject. There's a lot going on. It's yeah. So let me just jump right into it. So I really appreciate everybody that's joined the call for another round of tariffs and trade war that's been brewing between Canada and the US. And a big thank you to all the supplier and manufacturers I've gotten a chance to talk with in the last couple weeks. It has been incredibly helpful for me to see how things are going on the ground and how things are changing for you and how members are adapting to the uncertainty. For a bit of positivity in a conversation today that's going to be less than, I want to say this at the start of how honored I am to be in our industry with members with the resolve that I have seen in the last couple weeks. You all are incredible. I'm certain, regardless of the issues we have ahead, our members will continue to fight with, grace and creativity. The topic at hand is not one I take any joy in, as I mentioned, but our members have been no small beacon of light. So with that sentimentality, let's jump in. So there's a lot we can talk about when it comes to our current situation, and I'm going to do my best to give plenty of time to our viewers to ask questions and open up discussion. So, but, after we're done, don't hesitate to reach out to me
Adrian?
directly if you have additional questions.
Adrian,
So
can I
first,
stop you for a sec?
we are going to...
No. Adrian?
Yes, Terry?
We're getting a lot of audio issues. Maybe kill your camera. See if that helps it. Okay.
Yes. Sure. Any better?
Sounds like it. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So yeah, first I'm going to run through the timeline of this trade war to date. For whatever reason, or whatever your opinion is of AI chatbots, I'll admit I lean on them a lot when I'm trying to gather complex information. But I think you all will find it entertaining to say that when I tried to ask ChatGPT to help me summarize the timeline of this trade war to bat, it was horrible at it. I just absolutely dismal at trying to provide accurate information, which I think most of us can appreciate. Keeping up with this has been really challenging. So trying to get the dates and actions clear is definitely been a challenge. So we'll go through all of that. So next, I'm going to go through the basics of the history behind harmonized commodity descriptions and coding systems, or HS code, which is for what the product associations look like whenever they hit the border. And then we're also going to lean into some various shipping terms and how they impact seller-buyer responsibilities when dealing with duties. And then hoping we can clean up the conversation of who is responsible when it comes to when tariffs are applied. And then last is going to be some suggestions on what you all can do as far as those changes. I've gotten to sit in a handful of webinars and talks about tariffs over the last 2 months. I'll admit many of the suggestions to expand market isn't overly applicable to the fenestration industry, but there's still a lot of good strategies to consider. Um, and at the end of this, we're going to talk a little bit about what you can expect from Fenestration Canada and what you can expect as far as my efforts and our efforts are concerned to help support you. So yeah, let's jump into the timeline. So on November 26th, I was sitting on a call with my counterpart at WDMA, and we were discussing the Truth Social post Trump had put out about tariffing the US and Canada 25%. Immediately it struck me as something concerning given what we had seen from Trump in the previous administration. So I remember starting a presentation in December for what we gave in January on this topic. And I'll admit, I knew almost nothing about tariffs or their history or how a trade war would look like. And so I definitely drinking through a hose for the last couple months. So, his initial or Trump's initial rationale for the threat was fentanyl coming in from Canada and Mexico, which he used to justify various national emergencies and what's called the IEEPA, or the International Economic Powers Act, that gave him unilateral power to apply tariffs without congressional or judicial oversight. So in response, the Canadian government kind of scrambled and started putting together a border security plan that they formally announced December 16th, 2024. And since then, there's been progress on implementing additional resources, with all the criticism that accompanied any rushed budget project, which there have definitely been flaws in trying to implement that. But, I think they genuinely tried to act as quickly as possible. So on January 31st, the Trump administration moved forward with language to apply 25% tariff on all Canadian and Mexican goods with a reduced rate of 10% on crude oil and energy products, which is roughly where the executive order language still sits. On February 1st, Canada announces phase one of counter tariffs, which is aimed at goods that could be easily replaced by Canadian goods readily available and targeted Republican states that supported Donald Trump. So alcohol has been the low-hanging fruit, and BC, Ontario, Manitoba has already made some changes to remove U.S. alcohol from their shelves and have begun to break down some of the interprovincial trade barriers that allows for the different provinces now to trade alcohol. So I'll be honest, from my standpoint, this first phase really was it wasn't a bad first step. It probably put pressure where it belonged. Not that we support counter tariffs at all. So after a lot of speculation throughout the course of January, the U.S. agreed at the 11th hour to delay the tariffs by 30 days on the tariff front until about the end of February. So March 2nd, 3rd, Trump confirms that he's going to continue on with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico and implements on March 4th. Canada then implements phase one of these counter tariffs. So on the same day, Trump then threatens or tells the world that he will implement a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum. So that is almost identical to the steel and aluminum tariff that he put into place in 2018. On March 6th, Trump starts the day with a reprieve to automakers on tariffs after the big three automaker CEOs come to a meeting with Trump. Later in the day, Trump then puts a reprieve on items covered by the U.S.-Mexico Trade Canada Free Trade Agreement, or the UMCFT or CFA, previously NAFTA. An important point to make is that this was not a complete pause. This did add tariffs to about 70% of Canadian products, but our industry material was covered under the free trade agreement. So March 7th, Canada unveils the second phase of counter tariffs, which are out for public comment until March 25th. We will get more into this in a slide here in just a minute. So without specific provocation, Trump on March 8th revisited a gripe that he had during his first term about tariffs that were placed on U.S. dairy products. The administration is now threatening to put a 250% tariff on dairy products. At least as of now, or at least as of an hour ago, I've not seen an executive order to this effect. On Monday, Ontario announced a 25% tariff on electricity prices to the states effective immediately. In retaliation, Trump declared that the steel and aluminum tariffs that were Canada would have an additional 25% to that because of the counter, or because of the Ontario tariffs. By the end of yesterday, Ontario had rolled back that tariff on electricity, and Trump had rolled back his doubling down of the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada. It's worth noting that the steel and aluminum tariffs are, like I said, identical to the original, with one key difference. They removed the de minimis, or an $800 per person per day that could cross the border without tariffs being applied. This is something I'll keep an eye on for as we kind of go through the next 30-day window and we see the free trade agreement get revisited. But yeah, so expect more information on the de minimis later. I'm expecting that one to come off. It was already a threat when the initial 25% went through. So what's next? Yeah, as I mentioned, oh shoot, sorry guys. So as I mentioned, the steel and aluminum tariffs did go into place. By March 25th, phase 2 of the counter tariffs will go into effect. April 5th marks when items exempted from the USMCA agreement would go back into effect on the US side. And an interesting development to keep an eye on is Canada's request for consultation from the World Trade Organization on whether the US has violated their free trade agreement. We'll know by May 4th whether or not the WTO considers this a case worth pursuing. There's some interesting repercussions if the WTO determines that the US has in fact violated its free trade agreement. Admittedly, a lot of their power, I think Canada is already kind of taking a step further than the WTO would like to see. But something that would be additional to what we're already doing is the WTO could authorize trade sanctions against the US beyond Canada and Mexico, so that they would essentially provide free game to the rest of the members of the WTO to punish the US as they see appropriate. So let's make our transition into the learning a little bit more about the system that governs the trade between countries. So the Harmonized Commodity Description and Coding System, or HS for short. Before the HS was formally adopted in 1988 by the World Customs Organizations, countries had their own classification system. And in a growing global traded market, that created some really difficult inconsistencies to address. The HS system covers any and all products possible in the known world. And every 5 years, the categories and subcategories are updated to reflect updates in trade and technology. The HS system is arguably the most effective tool in tracking imports and exports that we have available currently. Although, as I've talked about, or I've talked with several people about, it is flawed, and perhaps more so when you've got a good free trade agreement, because people just don't take it as seriously. So, but for future purposes of being able to collect information and understand how trade is being impacted, the HS system is one of the most reliable data sources you could find. So as an example of an HS system, I'm going to take a good look at a PVC window. So an HS code consists of a 6-digit code that defines which chapter the item falls under, which heading the item falls under, and the subheading of that item. So for a vinyl window, it is 39 is the chapter, 39th chapter. The heading is 25. which is builders' wares of plastic, not elsewhere specified. And then the subheading is under doors, windows, their frames, and thresholds for doors. There's also the potential for a 6-digit number representing nationally specific codes. Both Canada and the US have them. If you take a good look at our phase 2 tariffs, you'll see there is 8 digits that can be attributed to some of them. So each country kind of has their own flexibility to add this additional complexity. So for what it's worth, the Canadian tariff schedule, or the schedule that applies to countries that have items that have been tariffed, is over 2,000 pages in its comprehensive form. And when it comes to products, there are roughly 5,600 different subheadings, without including national specifics, that there are substantial transformation and trade rules for. So when these items hit the border, the broker and the custom agent has to determine the call it trade rules associated to that item and what needs to be done with it. It sounds like a really complicated job. And for everyone, please write your questions. It's the thing I'm looking forward to in this conversation the most, is having an open discussion at the end. And I promise this presentation will take all of about another 15 minutes. So I'm going to give you guys about 30 minutes for us to discuss all of this. So I'm going to break off of our learning phase 2 counter tariffs that are slated to go into effect March 25th. I honestly didn't know where I wanted to fit this discussion, but it needs to be added. Arguably, this item in the discussion is one of the most dangerous to our industry. There's enough entries that I cannot seem to get a clear number of the items proposed for phase 1 overall. But in those are all of the HS codes listed here. The most concerning for our industry is glass. For those who do not know, Canada does not produce our own float glass, and we buy nearly 90% of all of our glass from the US. So this requires the most urgent and immediate attention of our members, government officials, and association partners. Over the last week, I've been reaching out to various government officials, both nationally and provincially, and requesting cooperation with our partners to strengthen our voice, and have put through the formal national channels our deep concern about what would happen to our industry if this counter tariff list would go through unchanged. The tariff threat by the US has the capability of shrinking our market. But only an action like this by our own government has the ability to completely cripple our industry. So you'll hear this at the end of the presentation, but it's worth saying twice. I strongly recommend reaching out to your MP and providing your concerns. We recently released our statement from Fenestration Canada that you can find on our website, and I am available if you need any support. Over the next 13 days, we need to do whatever we can to get glass off their list. Otherwise, the repercussions are frankly beyond my comprehension. So I know it's a bit hard to transition from a slide like that, but I hope you'll shift gears with me while we get back into education mode for a few more. So let's talk about how border trade works. When you have a product you send over the border that requires tariffs and duties to be applied, the broker or importing company provides information on their product, such as HS code, description, value, quantity, and where it came from. The more information the broker or the border agent has, the more accurately they can assess for various tariff charges. So the window now shows up at the US border with relevant information. The US customs agent evaluates that information provided and then determines risk and if an inspection is necessary. So this is the evaluation portion. Risk is assessed on a variety of factors, but most prevalently is country of origin, HS code provided, and then on individual transporting and the individual that's transporting that good. Low risk situations typically have a 10 to 15% inspection rate. And there's a lot of different tools that can be used depending on the sophistication of the port of entry as far as evaluating for those goods. On medium to high risk goods, this inspection rate can be 50% plus. So you can have a border agent actually going after, more than half of the goods that are associated to a particular HS code if the country is risky, if they've seen that other behaviors look like they're not being honest. There's a lot to that. So based on the feedback I've gotten from the CFIB and the BDO, be careful if you're attempting to play how you represent value with your product. I respect that it's going to be really tempting to show a much lower cost on goods than the actual contract value. But with the border becoming such a focus, I'm expecting the flags to be raised a lot faster than they would have been in the past if goods are off by too high of, call it, an average margin. And I have no idea what that looks like yet. I'll be honest. I think that's one of those areas that you'll see me dig into further is how they're evaluating for that. So once the valuation is completed, a duty rate is then applied, payment is assigned to the responsible party, and then is cleared for entry into the country. So the who for who is responsible for paying the duty bill, I think is really important and something that I've kind of talked about in different spheres, but it's something that I think most people don't understand how complex this topic actually is. So we have what's called Incoterms or international commercial terms, which is the various shipping conditions that can happen, or the legal shipping conditions that you can call for. So there's 11, and here's an infographic that I've pulled that I thought did a really good job representing. I'll be honest, I debated on whether or not to do a full breakdown of the Incoterms and give you more insight on it. I don't want to spend that kind of time on this tech talk, so feel free to reach out. I'm happy to point you in the direction of where I've been learning about Incoterms and what I know about at this point, and even how we can support you in certain places. But know that depending on which Incoterm you or your customer have included in your contract agreement will determine who owns the tax liability. So who owns the duty responsibility and the delivery responsibilities. I actually meant to say it earlier. If you hear me interchanging between tariffs and duties, legally, they're essentially the same thing. There's very little difference between those terms. And so if you hear me use those two, those are actually the same thing for the most part. So let's get into another slide that I wasn't 100% sure I was going to include, but because of how confusing it is to talk about tariffs, I figured it's kind of nice to go back to the basics on this particular point. So when U.S. tariffs are put into place against Canada, those are costs that are added to products that Canada sells to the US or what US customers buy from Canada. Eventually, the duties paid go to the US government. Alternatively, when counter tariffs are placed by Canada on US goods, the products that the US sells into Canada or Canadians buy from the US gets that duty tax. This ultimately goes back to the Canadian government. At the end of the day, the business is the first to have to decide how the price their products deal with is modified. And more often than not, those costs are passed directly to consumers, and often with increases beyond the tax that was charged. So now that I've kind of set that as a basic, I appreciate you bearing with me. It's I know most people already understand this, but it's amazing to me how oftentimes that whole sentiment has gotten mixed up. So let's now start into some strategies you can be thinking about when it comes to navigating these changes. Before I get started, I should disclaimer, I've already said earlier, I'm not a professional on this particular topic. I have listened to a lot of people that are, And if you get into legal or accounting items, you really need to you need to bring a lawyer or an accountant in. I have some suggestions at this point that I can make references to, but yeah, it's important that if you have legal or accounting advice that you need, you should ask the professional. So now with my disclaimer out of the way, so when it comes to potential contract additions, one of the first things that I would recommend, and we kind of talked about incoms, is setting specifically what income you are associating for your contracts. If you don't already explicitly call out what type of term is used, it's time to start being more diligent about how you apply responsibilities at the border. This will very much change the way that you look at whether or not you're responsible for how that product is getting to that customer, who's paying the duties for that. It becomes really important for you to start thinking about that in your contracts. So next is even calling out explicit duty payment responsibilities. So being explicit on who owns the responsibility for that duty. As a good example, whenever you are owning the shipment down to the US, and again, depends on your Incoterms, it depends on what contract terms you have, but if it's not defined, you as the business are likely to get the bill from the border that says, I owe this much. If you are the one that has a truck that you are paying for, or that's your truck and bringing it down to the US. So if you're not clear about who's paying that, don't expect the conversation about a U.S. tariff is something that's only paid by U.S. businesses. That's not that conversation isn't true. So next is a contract addition called a non-payment consequence clause. So if you're shipping your product from Canada to the US and managing the broker and the information provided at the border, like I said, you're likely to get the bill. And if you've already taken advice and added points 1 and 2, then you'll want to make sure you protect yourself from getting the bill from the border and the customer not paying it in a timely manner. So this clause will help you clarify expectations on when the bill needs to be paid, and if you pay it, when you need to be reimbursed for those costs. So last is clarifying customs clearance responsibilities. It's your opportunity to decide how much risk you want to take on, and when it comes to managing the border at all. You could essentially write it into your contract that the information that's provided to the broker and the border is the customer's responsibility. It's such an individual business conversation, so it's good for you to evaluate your practices and determine what is, call it, comfortable for you and comfortable for your customers. So next is dedicated. This next slide is dedicated if you are buying U.S. goods and you're shipping your products completed to the U.S. So for many of the people on this call, that especially manufacturers, that's likely you, considering that nearly 90% of the glass is bought by a Canadian manufacturer from the U.S. So the first and probably easiest thing to do is what's called an HTS 9801, or a duty avoidance with goods returned. There's a few things you'll need to know about that process. When paperwork is submitted, you'll have to have proof of export that shows shipping records and export declarations to determine that the goods originally left the U.S. It's worth noting that the item needs to be unchanged in character, meaning that there needs to be limited to no modifications to that good. So in the case of buying IGUs in the States and adding them to Windows, the IGU cannot be modified in any way that may potentially alter the HS code. So for instance, if somebody took an IGU and I don't know, put an obscure film on it that now turns it into the subcategory that is associated to obscured windows. That would be changing the character of that glass. It's a horrible idea, but you get my example. So next is what's called a duty drawback for re-exported U.S. components. So if for whatever reason the goods don't qualify for HTS 9801, you can still apply for a duty refund. This can be applied to any duties that the Canadian government applies to glass refunded by the US. It's not 100% on whether or not you can do both. I don't know if you can do both. That will actually require a bit more looking, but you've got both options. And then last is Canada also has a duty drawback system that you can look into. And then final is transfer pricing. So if you have a company that has business on both sides of the border, and you've got a formal business set up on both sides, there's some accounting practices that you can adjust internal transfer pricing to allocate profits more efficiently and minimize your tax liability at the border. The next piece is tariff engineering and final construction. I think the term tariff engineering is really funny. And really, these wind up being kind of the same thing in practicality for me, but I'll go ahead and define the two just so we understand. So tariff engineering is where you break up your shipments or products in such a way that you manage the tariff liability. Final construction is intentionally completing substantial transformation in the country you are shipping to. So, like I said, in reality, it's the same thing. But here's how the scenario could play out, and here's kind of what I've heard from other manufacturers, what they're thinking about. So you could ship your glass, hardware, and frame down to the US and declare the individual parts instead of the finished product. That allows you to avoid, call it your labor and your margin as far as value declaration. It is worth noting, though, in my conversation with the BDO, that they have seen other countries include terms that prevent this kind of workaround. So this is another one. We'll just have to stay on top of how the language is evolving as the tariffs go into place and as we see this kind of grow. So in the grand scheme of things, there's some basics I've heard from nearly every reliable source as far as how you mitigate some of the impact. So first is building your material stock whenever possible that you're getting from the US. Regardless of whether you're sending products down over the border or buying products from the US, every bank I've listened to warns of inflation being a significant risk. So cost increases it's hard for me to say inevitable, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say. Next is to map out and spend some time reevaluating your supply chain. That's a really hard thing. I think, frankly, unfair thing to expect from our members, considering they just did this. Many of them just did this back in COVID. And now the trade environment has completely shifted. And so it kind of requires you to go back to square one and look at what more sourcing from Canada and looking at alternative sources outside of the US looks like. So last and selfishly is engaging with Fenestration Canada and myself and your local MPs. As mentioned earlier, phase 2 of the tariffs are horrifically impactful to our industry. Getting your voice heard on things like this are going to be critical as we move forward. So what you can expect from us moving forward. As you can probably see, this presentation, this has been really consuming, not only for myself, but for so many others. So instead of the constant reactive states I keep seeing various organizations and governments kind of look at, with support from our board, I'm beginning to put a list of initiatives together to help not only address the immediate problems that have been created from the uncertainty in our current moment, but also look forward on how we can, as Winston Churchill said it best, not let a perfectly good crisis go to waste. I will say much of what I'm looking at that is now a problem has always been a problem. I would say much of the pain points we have in our industry just have been made worse. So we've got 4 pillars of focus that are aimed at improving our industry that I'm putting forward and mitigating systemic issues. So I'll be the first to say that we're very much still in a discovery period for most of these initiatives. And I hope members will feel comfortable to shoot me over an email if they have anything specific they'd like to add to the cause. By April, we'll have a more formal list to present to our members at the CGC and FenCon. So here's how the 4 pillars break down. First is safeguarding and improving our supply chain. An example on how we are doing this is some of the work we've already talked about in this presentation when it comes to voicing clearly the importance of glass in our industry. The longer term initiative we'll be looking at is how to incentivize float glass manufacturing in Canada so we're not wholly reliant on other countries for glass. Next is improving fenestration manufacturing capabilities. An example of a short-term improvement has been the reach outs I've been up to with our suppliers to figure out how to leverage our membership so members So manufacturers will have resources to know how they can pivot and manage their tariffs while utilizing our member base. Long term, we intend to put together a task group that will help evaluate program packages, either created by government or created by FenCan for manufacturing growth in Canada. Next is protection for members from unfair trade practices. You'll see from us today, actually a little bit ago, maybe 2 hours, a link to a non-compliance form that you can add information on companies or projects that you think potentially have non-compliant products on site for Terry and I to evaluate and do our best to support you. I will say we've been a little bit more aggressive. This is something that I think we're going to be taking a deeper look at on how this can be moved forward a bit more. Long term, there's some work that we can take a look at as far as supporting you when it comes to countries that are exporting to Canada who subsidize or dump product, but more conversations on that in the future. And then last is decreasing non-value added costs. This item is focused on addressing regulations and standards that don't add value to your business but cost you regularly. So again, more on that in the future. So as I mentioned, I wanted to give you guys some time. I'm actually a little over what I was expecting, so I now open it to discussion.
So, Adrian, we have a couple of comments, and then anybody that wants to can type in the Q&A, or if you'd rather come online, just raise your hand and I'll bring you in. So, Leslie says, for clarity, the aluminum and steel tariff did not include 7610.10 aluminum windows and doors in 2018, and it is in 2025. 65% of the cost for a complete window assembly is glass, 14% aluminum. Don't have issues paying on aluminum, but not 100% of the windows. A comment to that?
That sounds like she's got more information about aluminum than I have at the moment. It's really interesting. My understanding was, as kind of a general comment, the aluminum and steel tariff expanded on codes that weren't previously in and made it more punitive. Like that was kind of the general comment, and it kind of sounds. I mean, is that what you're hearing, Terry, from her comment?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds like you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then goes on to say, in regards to float glass, this is really interesting. I didn't know this. You'd be able to make a request for remission as it's provided undue hardship. As mentioned, there's no float glass providers in Canada. So, I mean, that sounds like, you could, actually, you know what? Leslie's raised her hand, so I'm going to bring her in. I don't see, one sec here. There. Okay. Should be able to speak, Leslie.
It's so good to hear from you, Leslie.
Hi, long time no see, for sure. I have a question. You had a fantastic list of the phase 2 counter tariffs. Where are you able to locate those online? Because I have a million customers that want to know how it's going to affect, so then I can go through and provide them feedback, but I'm unable to find a complete list on CBSA, Canada's.ca. I haven't been able to find the same list that you did. So you obviously are further ahead than I am on this.
I've got the link in my.
Oh, you do?
I've got a link that I can send you.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Can you throw it in the chat?
I can actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll throw it in the chat real quick for you, Leslie.
I tried to put it in the chat. There's nothing. Yeah, chat's been disabled. If we can have, that would be great. If most of us.
That's no problem.
Because I have the one from March 4th, but not one from today. Oh, there it is. Okay, that's how I can find it from that description.
Yeah, so this one is March 7th was when that was put out last. But give me a second. I'll throw it in the chat. But yeah, thanks for your comments. I mean, aluminum side is it's brutal. I think,
and
that's
I think for
worse.
Everybody, for the float glass and other glass, if you were able to 100% prove that you cannot get it from North America, for example, you just have to state your case. But there's a short timeline on it. I think it was 21 days from the tariff put in place, and you can request them back. If you're going US way, though, whoever is writing these new tariff codes have filled in all those little loopholes that doesn't allow you to ask for remission back later that I can find.
Yeah, I did find, it's a good reminder. What I probably need to do is put together a email list for you guys of the
That'd be
various links
fantastic. Thank
for
you.
member support. I'll put that on my list to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys.
Great, thanks, Leslie. Brian is asking about door thresholds. Are they included? I'm going to assume that that is dependent on the material they're made of.
Yeah. So are we talking about from the Canadian side or the US side? So the counter tariffs from Canada, the answer is yes, and it was included in the first round. No, sorry. Aluminum thresholds are included in phase two, but all actually, sorry. Phase one has door thresholds for the counter tariffs for Canada, and then for the US, yes, this includes door thresholds. So the answer is yes on door thresholds.
Okay, thanks. Katya says, this is an interesting question. Export from Canada to the USA of goods that are of an EU origin. Are tariffs required there?
Export from Canada to US. Yes. It's a really good question because it's actually one of the problems that I don't see the current. We're not at the maturity yet of this discussion to be talking about the workarounds, and like there are significant issues with countries that are selling to one country in order to avoid tariffs at another. So that's not really in the top level discussion yet, but just to simply answer it, if you've got an EU product that's sold to Canada and then that's sold to the US, and the US has a tariff on that particular HS code, yes, it will be tariffed. And frankly, the EU side doesn't matter to the US on that.
Okay. Another anonymous point here, and kind of along the same vein. So, in the case that we supply materials from Mexico, will they be subject to tariffs when crossing through the USA? So, you're buying from Mexico, it comes through the US into Canada.
Yeah, so no, actually. So there is a pass-through rule that allows you, like if you've got product that's just traveling from point of origin being Mexico and its landed origin is going to be Canada, it doesn't have to pay a tariff in order to go through the US to get there. So yeah, it's a great question. That one I can say is positive.
Excellent. Okay, and then can you confirm again what the dates were for the phase two counter tariffs?
Yeah, unless things are delayed, March 25th is the date that is projected for the phase two tariffs to go into place. But as Leslie mentioned, there are remission opportunities, and as I mentioned, I'll provide that link so you guys can take a look at that. That honestly might be your best option if we can't get the glass off the list, but I will be blunt, it is my number one priority for you guys is to work towards figuring out how we remove glass from that list, that it is unacceptable.
Okay, Gord, you've raised your hand. Let me see if I can open you up. Where are you? Right there. Bear with me. I just got to find you. There you go. Go ahead, Gord.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Gord.
Okay. All right. The one question that I have is you mentioned that the sort of the unfair trade practices, we're just encountering those in the last month. I'm just wondering, what are the channels that you go through as far as, the steps that you go through to try to get the information out there to the proper people? Just wondering if you have some type of information on that. We are forced for the first time to go ahead and try to do this.
Yeah, really, really good question. So I'll give just a little bit of what we've been doing in the background as far as that process is concerned. And I'm not, I So I have very much a like discovery phase, requirement phase in my head, and I would say this is still in discovery phase of how we're supposed to go through this process, or even how much of a problem it is. I think we've been hearing enough reports that I'm pretty sure we're at the requirement phase, meaning that we now need to just understand what it's going to take to implement it, kind of similar to what you're speaking about. So my experience so far has been when we've got members that have sent information that is compelling. So meaning I can't find certificates, I can't find anything that tells me that they're actually compliant in our market. The next step in BC is that we have an act that allows for some level of enforcement. So we can send it to the Ministry of Energy and Mines and have them take a good look at it. And I think we've had moderate success down that path. I'm still learning a bit on how the rest of the provinces are dealing with it. And I will say, based on my experience so far, there's very little in the way of enforcement capability. When it comes to windows and doors, there just isn't a lot when it comes to keeping compliance outside of just code. So some of the pathway we're going to have to take in provinces that don't have acts or regulations in place that provide enforcement capability at the provincial side is getting in front of the code enforcement groups or the AHJ groups, so that we can provide clear evidence to them so that they can be more on top of it. I would say before the tariff showed up, this was one of those core topics that I was intending to spend a lot more time on. And over this year, I've already been contacting different code groups. Terry and I have been working really diligently trying to build some of those relationships. And so over the course of the year and over the course of next year, expect that we will be working towards making sure those relationships are strong so that when you do have non-compliant product that are a problem, we can put that forward. Now, I say this as, call it single source problems. There is a bigger conversation that we can have when it comes to, call it subsidized or dumping products that are coming from other countries that are just not acting fairly in our market. But as I mentioned in the presentation, there's actually a bit more discussion about what that would look like before we can talk too openly about it. But I hope that's helpful, Gordon.
Yeah, I think I think at least that you point out that guys are working on it, and the direction that I can go here in our provincial government, I guess. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, please provide me the information. I think one of the best things I can ask for right now is if you guys have things like that, I am diligently working towards putting these potentially non-compliant products in front of authorities, even people that may not have any authority to do anything about it. But we need to start figuring out what the pathways look like to shut that down, because it's not fair to the rest of our manufacturers that are participating fairly.
Okay, so Brent says here, maybe a suggestion. I don't know if you've talked about it with anybody already, but can we lobby to Canada to remove tariffs from non-US countries such as China to open up, more purchasing options?
We can. It's a great question of whether or not we want to. It's a great question, because I think as we're looking at alternative buying options, it's going to be one of those places where we have to rethink. And I will be honest, Brent, it wasn't on my list and it is now. So thank you for that.
Okay, and then an anonymous question: are spacer products included in phase 2?
Yes.
Some of that depends on what they're made of.
The answer is yes. It's a part of the yes, it is. It's a part of the materials and the aluminum side. I think it was. I've got that long list of codes, and one of them is exactly that. So yes, sorry, spacer bars are included.
Okay, and then Greg says, how is rhesus affected for PVC extruders?
Resin.
I'm afraid I don't know what that is.
He means resin. Resin affected for PVC extruders.
Right.
Resin's on the phase 2 list for counter tariffs. Actually looked into that yesterday. There's one PVC resin company out in Niagara. That is our only resin PVC company in the country. So yeah. Okay. Hot melt, I actually don't know. I will have to look into that one, but good question.
Items such as insulated glass sealants, same thing, right? Insulating spacers. Yeah,
And
same,
yes.
same question. Okay.
Well, and the sealants are actually different than the spacer is, and the sealants
Yeah.
are included in the counter tariffs.
Okay, understanding of the topic, including CUSMA, if the materials are manufactured in Canada, are they subject to tariffs when imported into the US? To clarify, the raw material comes from overseas, is processed in Canada, then exported to the US. Will it be affected upon importation and vice versa?
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends
Yeah.
on what materials, but I think for just a simple answer, there are ways, depending on how the tariff schedule looks like for Canada, the country you're importing from, and for the US, for you to provide information for call it tax liability changes between those countries. And so the more information you can provide like that, or the more information you understand about how the tax liability holds, the more you can provide to the border that helps you mitigate that. But the simplest answer is circumvention is something that we don't have a lot of great tools for right now. And so you just have to look at it from a strictly, I have a Canadian product that I've now manufactured. If the material didn't come from the US, then US doesn't care about it, frankly.
Okay. What about polyamides in thermal brakes for aluminum? I'm not sure how you would separate that out, or is that a material that's imported, exported independently?
Yeah.
Not sure
As
there.
far as I understood, it was included, but I'll have to take another good look at that. But I remember there was, yeah, I'll take another good look at that. I hate to say yes or no. I think that'll be another one where I'll dig in a little bit.
I mean, router bits probably falls into some sort of tools.
Yes.
I would think yes. Giacomo says, do you have templates or recommendations for something like letters to clients summarizing due to changes on tariff policies, want to inform you that any amounts applied will be in your charge or similar? Done
It could
any
be created.
drafting of any of that? Yeah.
I have not seen any templates to that, but it is. I'd be happy to work with you on that if you want to email me at adrian@fenestrationcanada.ca. We could work on that a little bit, and if you'd be open to having it as a template for the other manufacturers, I think that's a great resource.
Okay, great. Okay, looking like that's it for questions. Anybody else? Gord, you've got a hand up there still. I'm going to assume that's old.
That's fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I think that's it. Adrian, thanks, man. It's a huge topic, and we certainly appreciate your efforts in digging into this and trying to help support our members through this crazy time that we're having. So appreciate that. So a couple of last comments. We've got a couple events coming up in April. The Civic Hotel in Surrey, we've got the Pacific Chapter Education Day on April 7th, followed by the Canadian Glazing Conference on April 8th. Again, those are at the Civic Hotel in Surrey. Then FenCon at the Winnipeg Convention Center, April 10th and 11th. And then our spring conference and AGM in Halifax, May 27th to 30th. You can check out all the info for those on our website. Thanks for attending today. Whoop, more questions.
Oh,
okay.
We got two more questions real quick. To your first question, is there any list of vendors or suppliers located in Canada? The answer is that's been something over the last week I've been working on, is collecting information from suppliers on how people are managing that, and that is a initiative that will be coming out in the next couple weeks. My hope, at least, is the next couple weeks, so you guys have an idea of who you can work with within our membership to help navigate the tariffs.
Yeah, and you can go on our members page on our website, and you can do filtering to see, where suppliers are and their materials, of course. So good place to look at that. Window hardware bought in the US will be hit with 25% tariffs.
Yes.
Yes.
Unequivocally, unfortunately. And it is a part of our official response to the federal government that we oppose any of the hardware tariff, counter tariff codes.
Okay, great. Okay, one last call for questions. Okay, I want to say thanks to Adrian. Thanks for everybody participating today, and thanks to our sponsor, OpenJanela. We'll see you next month at our next Tech Talks. Thanks, everybody.